Good evening, gentlemen. Sorry for the slightly late start. I apologize. So I think our goal today is simply to finish learning the Mishnah, however long that takes us, and then we need to move on to the Gemara because we spent a lot of time on this. I think we discussed Kol Shehu, or Boneh Kol Shehu. We discussed Makar B'Patish last year a little bit. There's obviously more to say about Makar B'Patish, but we discussed the Rishash L'Tosis Yom Tov about why Rashi explains differently Makar B'Patish here to how he explains it on Daf Ayin Gimel, and Tosis's thoughts about the definition of Makar B'Patish. What's left for us in the Mishnah is the klal the Mishnah gives. So this is the Mishnah on Kuf Beis on Beis Zah klal, says the Mishnah. Kol ha'osa melacha or melachto miskayemes b'Shabbos chayev. So Mishnah says a klal, anyone who does a melacha, and the melacha is miskayim, has kiyum, then chayev. Yeah.
Is this connected to the first piece, or is this now neutral?
It's all very unclear. It's a very unclear Mishnah. It's not really clear what the Zeh HaKlal is doing in this point in the Mishnah. It doesn't seem wholly disconnected because it then gets back to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who seems to add a point in seemingly in the definition of Makar B'Patish. So this seems to be some form of continuation. I mean, we'll see shortly. The very translation of the phrase is unclear. What does it mean? Melachta mitkayem es b'Shabbos, that the melacha has a kiyum. What's the b'Shabbos going on, by the way? Is that kol ha'osa melacha or melachta mitkayem es b'Shabbos? The melacha has a kiyum on Shabbos, or kol ha'osa melacha melachta mitkayem es? Anyone who does the melacha and the melacha mitkayem es on Shabbos. When else do you do the melacha? In which case we need to ponder, like now the Mishnah is waking up and telling us that if you do this on Shabbos, not on weekday, Boneh b'Yei chayev. Boneh Kol Shehu. Well, maybe it should point out we're talking about Boneh on Shabbos, because if it's Boneh on the weekday, there's no prohibition on Boneh. Like that's what the Mishnah needs to say. The very, in Eretz Yisrael, a big genre of communication around politics and Halacha and so on is around Setelach. These wall posters. So the very last, often these Setelach give quotes from various Gedolim and so on about their views, and they're not only always entirely reliable. I hope that doesn't come as a shock to anyone. And the very last settle, when we were still living in Eretz Yisrael before we moved back to England, it always sticks in my mind. The very last settle was supposedly signed by 5 of the most senior poskim in Klal Yisrael. And it was at the time when the Somet wheelchairs were coming out, and there was a lot of halachic debate about whether the Groma solution was or wasn't a good solution, a very legitimate halachic debate. And the settle said, we are revealing our opinion, our psak halacha, that was not allowed to use electric wheelchairs. Can anyone see anything wrong with that psak? They didn't mention on Shabbos. It's always stuck in my mind and I don't believe for a second that to be a posek means you're trained to draft things well. I mean, the bread and butter of the tools of the trade of being a posek is that you try and speak. Now, anyone can slip up occasionally, once. But if you have a settle supposedly signed by 5 of the most senior posek in Klal Yisrael, it's inconceivable that someone whose career is dedicated to halacha and the correct legal drafting of rulings would allow such a ruling to go out in their name. So it always struck me as it's been in my mind as like it was my departing gift from Eretz Yisrael. Unfortunately, that's the thing. But the Mishnah over here, so here the Mishnah wakes up and tells us B'Shabbos, very, very, very mysterious Mishnah, B'Shabbos. Okay, so Rashi says the klal is kol ha'osa melacha melachta miskayemes. Rashi says sheyesh miskayemes kiyotze boi. And then there's a bit of a Gersa confusion over here, but let's go with the continuation. Ve'ein moisif allow. So Rashi understands the rule is anything which you could leave as is without adding to it. That's the definition of what makes something a melacha, that you could leave it as is without adding to it. So what's the point of this Zeh HaKlal according to Rashi? We've just had a Mishnah which has really been... What's the topic of our Mishnah? What's the subject of our Mishnah? So the subject of our Mishnah is shiurim of melachos. How much of a melacha do you have to be? The subject of the Mishnah is not to list the melachos. That was already Perek Klal Gadol, Daf Ayin Gimel. So the genre of the Mishnah is that at least some melachos do not have a halacha l'mishma Sinai measure or share, unlike other melachos. Many food melachos have grogeres as a share. These melachos are kol shehu. So what is the principle? How much you have to do? The answer is anything that has some sort of kiyum. That the kiyum, you don't need to add on it. It has its own value as is without needing to add anything on it. That's the share of a melacha. Now, the Zeh HaKlal can't be coming to include anything because we know there are melachos which have different shiurim, which have, as I mentioned, cooking and the food production melachos have a shiur of gogaras. The pshat in the Mishnah is that any melacha which has a shiur of kol shehu means that it has some sort of value in and of in itself without an addition. The Gemara on without cheating too much, the Gemara on Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph asks Zeh HaKlal lasuye mai. What's this coming to include? In other words, it can't be coming to include everything because we know it doesn't mean all melachas. So it's coming to include other examples of melachas in the family of building and makeh b'patish and stonework. What's sort of the melachas that are listed over here is sort of masonry and building type melachas. So what's Zeh HaKlal coming to include? And the Gemara says, whatever it answers. I mean, the answer to the Gemara is, where you have a large block, a large stone, and you could carve out of it a full a full unit of measure, and instead you only carve out of it a kapiza, which is half a kav, which is 3 lug. And even though you're going to add to it, nonetheless, there are some who leave as is, and therefore it has a value in the malacha itself. So you see very clearly, by the way, if you have a rock and you chip out a milliliter measure, at least in the time of the Mishnah, that wouldn't be included in kol shehu. Kol shehu doesn't mean any amount. Kol shehu means anything that has something to it, some utility to it. And in those days, at least, maybe nowadays with syringes and medication, I know we use tiny quantities, but in those days, half kav wasn't a good measuring container. Nonetheless, since some people use a half kav as a measuring container, even though normally you'd finish it off to a full kav, that's deemed miskayemes. That's pshat in the Mishnah with the Zeh HaKlal of the Gemara on the next page.
You're saying that only applied to culture who are
Yeah, I think so. Yes, correct. That's what I'm understanding.
We find that the halacha kiyum with other halachas as well.
Not this translation of the word miskayemes. Because Rashi learns the Mishnah that the point isn't that a degree of permanence, an outcome, or something like that. The point is a measure of significance and chashivas, which is it has a utility in its own right, and some people stop the malacha there and don't add anything to it. Now, Rashi now gives it's not clear whether he says this word in Mesifin or but even without that, that's what Rashi says. Sheyesh miskayemes kiyotzapo. There are those that keep it as is, and Rashi repeats that on the next Amud when he says yesh mekaymin kain. There are those that keep it so this that I'll come to a moment. There's half look, there's half look and whole look. They're yesh mekaymin. So there are those that keep it like that. So that seems to be the translation. Rashi, I didn't put on the source sheets. I don't think I put it in the source sheets, but there's a run that quotes Rashi as in Mesifin or there's a Meiri that says someone Mekayim it below Tosefes. That seems to be a whole family of Rishonim who learn it like that. So whatever the exact Girsa in our Rashi is, that seems to be basically the pshat in Rashi. That's what I'm saying. We'll see other Rishonim learn differently, but according to Rashi, the point isn't that it has a degree of kiyum as opposed to impermanence. The point is the chashivas of the melacha, the significance of the outcome. That's how Rashi's learning. Yeah, sorry, Rafi.
With regard to Eva.
Yes.
And that's other share.
Yeah. So again, I think I printed the Mishnah Berurah, right? Yeah, I put the Mishnah Berurah and Shanti and they're learning a different pshat, and we'll come to it. I think let's take it bit by bit. But for now, that's what we see in Rashi. Yeah.
I have a brick, like a brick down on the floor. You don't mean I'm going to add more to the structure. That's not my end of thinking of things. That's considered Boneh and add a brick there, right? Done the last by a single brick in the ground. Do you mean it was about the specific action or not?
Rashi says later that it's enough that yesh she'in musifin alav, yesh she'mekayim kain. It has to have some chashivas, it has to have some utility to itself that you wouldn't add to it.
In the line of my building I'm going to make.
I suppose there are people that put stones on the ground, like you see, I don't know, garden arrangements or things like that. It has some significance to it. If I hollow out a stone and just put a tiny little chip in the ground, that's nothing. It has to have some significance to it. That's how Rashi seems to understand the Mishnah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little hesitant here because there's a little bit of a dearth of examples and sources, and I don't quite understand everything in the Mishnah. So that's why I'm speaking a little bit tentatively, but that's what I think Rashi is saying. If anyone has a different shot, but that's how I understood Rashi. Yeah, and the Gemara on Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph. Yeah. Okay, so that's Rashi's shot. I think I printed on the sheets the Piskei Rid. I hope I did. Yeah. Okay, the Rid is Rabbi Yosef Ditrani. We've learned him before, Tosfos Rid, Piskei Rid. He wrote two Sfarim. He wrote just that's a bit of history, just to contextualize the Rid. Yosef Ditrani, as his name sounds, he was an Italian Rishon. He was not really from the school of the Bali Tosfos. He was relatively near the end, historically, several generations after Rashi. He wrote, though, what he called his Tosfos, his additional commentaries on Shas, but they're not really part of the family of thinking of the Bali Tosfos. He's an Italian Rishon, a little bit sort of his own, slightly out of the Torah Center of France. And he also wrote Piskei Harid. And we have both of them on Masechet Shabbat, and he often takes an original approach. He's sort of his own Beis HaMedrash in a sense. And he says, first of all, he quotes Rashi. He calls Rashi Mora, that's the language, the teacher. By the Tosfos Rid's generation, Rashi has become Hamora, the teacher. And he quotes Rashi. He quotes Rashi as saying, Ve'ein Mosifin Alav. That seems the Gersa he has in Rashi, which is one variant of the text that we have. And then he disagrees. He says, Ve'ein Onirili. Because he says, in that case, any kol shehu that you do, if it's not the final kol shehu, you wouldn't be chayiv on it. But surely, the Mishnah says that even a kol shehu is enough. So what does Rashi mean? Rashi seems to say that you're only chayiv if you do quite a significant amount of work, right? That's what Rashi is saying. You have to etch out a whole. Oh, my internet seems to be fading over here. I don't know if anyone online can hear me. I guess I'll record myself here. Rashi seems to be saying that you have to carve out, for example, a whole 3 lug of a stone before you're chayiv. So he says, how's that kol shehu? So he doesn't understand what Rashi's saying, and he says anything which is you are going to be mosif olav harbe, but that kol shehu will be a component of your end result. That's already enough. It's a completely different way of thinking about what melacha is. So if you're doing something which is an interim step, but will eventually be negated, that's not called a melacha. But if you're doing something which eventually will add up to being a part of the sum totality of what you wanted to achieve, that would be called a melacha. So as long as look, all achievements, the Tosfos Rid's point, the Piskei Rid's point is, all achievements are made up of little bit plus little bit plus little bit plus little bit. So why should we favor the last chip that you're doing? I mean, maybe in Makat B'Patish that's as far, but in regular melachas, why should we favor the last bit that you're hollowing out more than the first bit that you're hollowing out? The sum totality of the container that you've carved out of a stone is made out of lots of little carvings. So why should you need what? According to Rashi, you can do lots and lots of carvings without being chayiv for the melacha, and it's the last one that finishes the melacha. It's not like in one go you scoop out a whole 3 lug. So you scoop out a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and then the last one is chayiv. Why should that make any sense? So as long as the little bit that you did will be a positive part of the whole in making an outcome which has significance, that's enough to make you chayiv for the melacha on Shabbos. Is that how people read Rashi? Read the Tosfos Rid? That's
his wording in the second line, exactly very nearly that question, how it fits. We learned the question exactly as it said.
Okay, but in annuity, he says, I don't disagree with this. The im kain, if so, according to Rashi, until you do the last kol shehu, which doesn't have another step after it, you wouldn't be chayiv. So you do a chip and a chip and a chip, until you do the last kol shehu, you're not chayiv. So what's the Mishnah saying? The problem he's saying is the Mishnah says you're chayiv for a kol shehu, but it's not true that you're chayiv for a kol shehu. Haraya, the last kol shehu that you do is chayiv, and the first kol shehu that you do doesn't. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine someone chips out of a stone 3 lug minus a quarter, minus a cubic centimeter. And I chip out the last cubic centimeter. Who's chayiv? Only me, not everyone, not the other people. So a cubic centimeter is a kol shehu. And yet, this fellow who did 500 kol shehus was pater. I did 1 kol shehu and I'm chayiv because I did the last kol shehu. So the Mishnah is inaccurate. The Mishnah said you're chayiv for a kol shehu. It's not true. Because Haraya, my kol shehu was chayiv and your kol shehu wasn't chayiv. So it's a very strange model. So the Tosfos Rid says no, the Piskei Rid says no. I think any kol shehu which ends up as a positive contribution to the eventual melacha, that would be enough. If in the end the kol shehu I did is rendered meaningless because it's not a component of something, then not. But if were I to continue, it would prove to be a part of something that makes up something, an outcome which has a chashivas, then that's enough to give it the chashivas of a melacha with these melachos. That's understanding, yeah.
If I follow out tiny bit in Shabbos, and 3 weeks later someone else needs
No time scale. No time scale. In the Rambam, we come to time scales. And so, no, my culture that I did is enough to mechayiv me, even if it never gets finished off. The point isn't that it's going to be finished off. No, the point is that were it to be finished off, it would be a piece, a fragment of the eventual outcome that's enough to make it malacha. That's what kol shu means. That it has a significance as a component of the eventual outcome were the outcome to happen. Yeah, that's how he learns. Again, I'm a little tentative here. I am struggling a bit with translating everything that's going on, but that's what I think it means. Yes, sorry, Adam.
In the world of Ezekiel and Bor, the person does the last effort of the 10 to 12 in situations tied with a Masechet. So it's not, I know you can't compare of different things, but it's not a ridiculous thing to say the person who's doing the last bit could have some additional Shiur.
It's not. It is conceivable, certainly in Mazik, because it goes from not being a Mazik to being a Mazik. So it's the last straw that broke the camel's back. That's the thing that did the damage, the last tafach of the bow. Over here, though, and if it was Makah B'Patish, indeed Makah B'Patish may be like that. But here, if the melachot is Boneh, and the Mishnah says that for Boneh Yachai for Kol Shu, so the Piskei is saying, make up your mind. If Kol Shu of a cubic centimeter of carving is Machayev you, then, and you see that because the person who does the last cubic centimeter of the chatzi kav of the 3 lug is chayiv, then why is the person who's done the first quarter of the 3 lug less chayiv when the Mishnah says that you're chayiv for each culture? That is how I understood this question. Then he says, what about Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, where the Gemara says that the Zeh HaKlal is coming to say Dochat Kapiza B'Kava? His answer is Kapiza's lav dafka. It happens to be half a kav. Its point is, it's an interim step. If you hollow out half a kav, you're chayiv, even though everyone adds on to it. Even though it's incomplete. Since this half kav would eventually become a whole kav, it's a step on the way to creating a space of a whole kav. That's enough to make you chayiv. That's how he learns the Gemara later. No, arguing with Rashi. Absolutely arguing with Rashi.
That would be Rashi.
That's how he learned Rashi, and that's how we're learning Rashi, yeah. It's rare, but that's what Rashi says. Rashi may be pushed to this because of the Gemara on Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph. The Piskei reads in our Mishnah in a way is a simple explanation, but on Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph is a bit more of a kvetch. The Gemara says if you carve out half a kav from a kav, you're chayiv. Even though half a kav has no significance. Rashi says half a kav, some people keep half a kav. The Tosfot says, Piskei says it's nothing, nonetheless you're chayiv, because that's a step to the way. That's how I understand it. Yeah, but he's arguing with Rashi. I think that's very, very clear. Yeah. Okay, so in brief, Rashi learns.
Association with Chayyim, even though you're not going to, some people do.
That's a quote of Rashi. Or Pirish Hamor, Apish also knows of Yeshiva-style came. That's Rashi. But he says, also, Rashi is being consistent with his view, but I disagree with his translation of the Gemara, his explanation of the Gemara. Yeah. Okay, so far we've seen 2 pshatim. We've seen the Rashi that says only if you create a measure that some see it as having utility in its own right, even though most people want a larger thing. And the Tosfot says as long as it's a part which will prove to contribute to the end, that's enough. That's the thing. Okay, there's a third pshat in the Mishnah. And forgive me, I just want to whiz through this because I really don't. I want us to move on to the Mishnah in the next year, which I hope I printed, which is the Rambam. Yeah, the Rambam is in Perek Tes Halacha Yud Gimel, and the Rambam says again. The Rambam doesn't explain when he quotes when he's quoting Gemara or not. He doesn't put it in inverted commas. But the Rambam says the following words, and the Magen Mishnah says that he's coming from our Mishnah. He says, "V'chol she'ein melachta miskayemes b'Shabbos potter." Any case where your malacha isn't miskayim on Shabbos, you are potter. In other words, it's talking about a degree of permanence of the malacha. The malacha has to have an outcome. And this is a rule indeed, as Jaffe says, as Rafi pointed out, the Mishnah Berurah and the Halacha say, this isn't just in melachas boneh, it's a new principle, that malachas have to have a kiyum have to have some permanence to them. If you do a very temporary act that doesn't have enough kiyum, we've met this concept before by ksav that's not miskayim and so on. So it's a new principle that a malach has to have some kiyum. And again, I printed the Ritva on the source sheets where the Ritva says this clearly. I didn't quote it from the Rambam that he says that that's some degree of permanence to the malacha. Now, in this explanation, it's a bit funny that it comes in our Mishnah. It doesn't really seem to have any link to our Mishnah. In the Rid and Rashi, it's a continuation of defining kol shehu. In the Rambam, it's a new principle that malachas have to have some permanence. Now, here comes the interesting thing. How much of a permanence? And the Rambam reads the Mishnah as malachas miskayemes b'Shabbos. The malacha lasts at least for Shabbos. So if we ask ourselves how temporary an outcome or how permanent an outcome do you need for something to have a kiyum on Shabbos, the answer is, as the Ritva says explicitly and as the Rambam says, as long as there's a kiyum for Shabbos. And this indeed is the Mishnah Berurah and the Sha'at Tzion, which I printed. And it's very difficult to understand. If I do a malacha the last 5 minutes of Shabbos, would that be enough? What do we mean it has a kiyum for Shabbos? Is that a measure of time, or it's just as long as it lasts for Shabbos? It's almost a sort of quasi like conceptual machshava or spiritual thought. Let's say we take this on face value and say if you do a malacha Friday night, 23 hours before the end of Shabbos, you're only chayiv if the malacha is going to have a kiyum for 23 hours. If you do a malacha 5 minutes before the end of Shabbos, then you're chayiv even if the malacha only lasts for 5 minutes. Almost as if like the creative act that you're doing has to be an act for the whole time and zone of Shabbos. It's a very strange model of understanding things. It makes sense that malacha has to be a productive outcome. Productive outcomes have to have a degree of permanence. I can hear that, but it's not a degree of permanence that has to last X amount of time, a week or a day, 24 hours. It's a degree of permanence that has to last for Shabbos. Very strange gather. I don't know. This remains a bit of a mystery. Either way, just in terms of translation of the Mishnah, Rashi and Rabbeinu and the Tosfos Rid, the Piskei Rid, translate the Shabbos as going on when does the doer of the malacha do the malacha. So it's a bit funny. Like now the Mishnah is telling us, I'm talking about Shabbos, I'm not talking about Wednesday. Like my wheelchair settle. You can use electronic wheelchairs on Wednesdays, you can't use them on Shabbos. That's what the Mishnah is saying. Very, very difficult to understand. But that's how they translate it. According to the Rambam, the Shabbos fits beautifully. It has to be mitzkayim b'Shabbos. The kiyum, the malacha has to last at least for the length of Shabbos. However, conceptually, this is a little bit strange. What does this mean? Very difficult. All I'll conclude with is the Halacha brings an important Rashba, and the Rashba says that nothing in life lasts forever. Sorry, gentlemen, it's a sad fact, but nothing lasts forever. So miskayemes can't mean forever. We have to give some measure of how long the outcome is. I think we spoke about this when we spoke about melachot ksiva. I think I printed the Halacha then also. But basically, he says about ksiva that ksiva miskayemes. You can't say that the Ksav is miskayim forever. Nothing is miskayim forever. The Dead Sea Scrolls have had 2,000 years of life. That's an amazing thing. But nothing has 10,000 years of existence. So everything eventually evaporates and disappears. So the Rashba says the definition has to be mekayim as much as normal human expectation of kiyum is. What's its normal to write things for? So when you write a letter, you don't expect the letter to last forever, but the letter will last for long enough that people can read the letter. So the Rashba says the shir kiyum it's a very reasonable definition of a shir kiyum. It's as long as would be normal for that functionality. If you have writing which is going to evaporate after 5 minutes, that wouldn't be a normal writing. But writing that lasts long enough for the utility of this object. So if it's a book, you'd want it to last for a couple of years. If a letter, maybe it'd be enough that it can last for a few days. That's the shir that the Rashba gives. I'll just conclude actually with I'm never quite sure how to apply this halacha. I think one of you, Jeffrey maybe or Karen, you asked about chopsticks breaking. Yeah, chopsticks and Shabbos. So that seems to be makar b'patish. It's not other malacha, it's makar b'patish. So it's a real michshol actually that sometimes caterers put out that joins chopsticks and you break on Shabbos. It's makar b'patish. It's definitely also to Rabbanon. Is it chayv min Torah? So well, these chopsticks are quite strong. They're proper wooden chopsticks. They have a permanent kiyum. Except human usage is that we like disposing of things quickly because it's not worth washing up. So we use them just for 3 minutes on a kiddush and then they get put in the bin. according to the Rambam, it's miskayim for the whole of Shabbos. It is miskayim for the whole of Shabbos. I don't want it for that long, but it is miskayim. According to Rashba, it's how much is an utility for this. I suppose it lasts as long as my utility wants it for. I don't know. It's something to ponder. Okay, bottom line, before we leave the Mishnah, according to the Rambam, the Mishnah is saying a completely different klal, nothing to do with the Shiur of Kol Shehu. He's talking about, this is the place where the Mishnah says the rule of Kiyum. Very strange that the Mishnah brings it here. It's got nothing to do with the Mishnah, but the B'Shabbos reads nicely. It's not telling us when he's doing the melachot, it's telling us how long the melachot has to last for. And we're left with a halachic puzzle in the view of the Rambam, at least, which is, it's not okay halacha and Louise. Either way, it's also in practical halacha. But were we to be the based in the Sanhedrin and have to work out whether someone's chayav carbon or not chayav carbon, or chas v'shalom chayav misa or not, we'd have to work out what does the Rambam mean. Does he mean a period of time, or does he mean it lasts to the end of Shabbos? In which case, it'd be enough whether I do the melachot at the beginning of Shabbos or end of Shabbos. But that's the reading of the Mishnah.
Is there any grouping first, just saying Boneh, culture, who, and then going on to the other melachot?
It's a bit funny that after saying a rule about shiurim of kol shehu with building type melachos, the Sata Shavim, all these examples, they're all building type melachos, is then it says Zakal, that has nothing to do with anything.
In the first two parts, we've got
I don't know.
kol shehu, and then as if then the Sata is something else.
Yeah, I hear your point. It clusters them together. I don't know. I didn't think about it. I don't know. Not sure. Right, okay, that's a fair point. If they all end up to be examples of Makkah B'Patish, then we'd understand why they're clustered. But the Gemara doesn't seem convinced of that. Okay, but it's a good point, yeah. Okay. Okay, well, Emes Hashem Sunday. But I'll send my Makomis so we can start going through the Gemara on Sunday. I'm sorry that we spent so long on the Mishnah, but that's what came out. Okay, I wish everyone online a good evening also. Thank you so much for joining.